Hello, guests and colleagues. Welcome to stream 2 of our conference today, and to the panel on primary and high school education. My name is Florian Rabenstein. I work for UNICEF Kenya as an education officer on innovation and inclusive education. And I'm very happy to have several panel members here with me today to discuss the issue of primary and secondary education and accessibility, and how digital accessibility can support the access to quality education, particularly for children with disabilities. We will do a quick introduction to start us off. On the screen, we have Fred Haga from the Ministry of Education in Kenya. He's the acting director of special needs education in the Ministry of Education in Kenya, along with Leopoldine Nakashole from the Ministry of Education in Namibia. We have today with us also Ambrose Murangira from Light for the World. He's an advocate from Uganda and representing an NGO, Light for the World, here today on the panel. And last but not least, we have Irene from Enable, from our host of the organization, from the organizing committee, executive director of Enable, is with us on the panel as well. And it's a pleasure to have her with us and this list of speakers. So I would please ask our speakers to very quickly introduce themselves as well and highlight the name, the current position. I hope I mentioned that one correctly, but please mention it again, and especially highlight your briefly your interest in this area of digital accessibility. What brought you to this discussion, and then we will go over to our first question. So could I ask Fred briefly to introduce himself, and then we go over to Leopoldine.
Thank you, Florian. Good morning, everybody. And for those in other time zones, good afternoon, probably good evening. I'm sorry I'm not able to turn my camera on, but my name is Fredrick Haga. I work for the Ministry of Education in the Directorate of Special Needs Education. I currently head that directorate, which has the mandate of coordinating education services for learners with disabilities and other special needs in the country. I am extremely interested in digital accessibility and connectivity because that's an enabler in terms of the education services in this country. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to some of the colleagues who might be in afternoon in their country. I'm Leopoldine Nakashole. As Florian has introduced me, I work for Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture in Namibia, and Directorate Program Quality Assurance, where I'm responsible for special programs and schools. Under special programs and schools, we take care of all education-related matters that are related to different disability at a national level, and all the special programs that are geared towards marginalized and vulnerable children. Thank you.
Could I ask Ambrose to go next to briefly introduce yourself? Hello, Ambrose. Thank you, Ambrose, for the introduction as well. Last but not least, could I please ask Irene to introduce herself as well, founder of Enable.
Thank you, Florian. My name is Irene Mbari-Kirika, the founder and executive director of Enable. And for us, accessibility is at the heart of everything that we do, because without accessible content, the blind and low vision students and youth that we serve cannot access information and cannot access devices. So this is a very, very crucial topic to us. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I can just stay with you first, Irene. You mentioned the issue, the importance, why it is so important to work on digital accessibility. We all now know that last couple of months were really impacted by COVID-19, school closures on much of the continent. So I was wondering if you could elaborate briefly. Your organization conducted a brief case study. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on schools providing educations to children with disabilities? I mentioned some schools were closed, some are slowly reopening. So if you could share your insights on that, that would be much appreciated. And we have roughly 4 minutes, please. So
the purpose for the study was just to investigate the effects of COVID-19 on learners with disabilities, and to also investigate the psychosocial effects of COVID-19 on families. So we partnered with the Ministry of Education, the Directorate for Special Education, and we also partnered with UK8, the Department for International Development. So the whole point was to focus really on learners with disabilities and regular learners, so that we see, is there a difference? At the same time, we picked 4 types of disabilities. We picked visual impairments, we picked hearing impairments, physical, and learning disabilities. So we sampled about 650 participants, and this group was made up of students with and without disabilities, their parents, and also teachers. We also made sure that we were spread across 4 counties in Kenya. So we had Kiambu County, Meru County, Mombasa County, and Siaya County. And this covered also students from both primary school and high school. So some of the key findings that we wanted to share today, one, there's definitely some unsupervised learning that's going on across the country. And but what we found is that parents are giving household chores a priority to learning. And there's also a big challenge. There are no accessible materials for students with disabilities, which is a big problem. At the same time, the second finding key finding was few students are engaged in online or electronic learning, which has become very popular right now because of COVID-19. And less than half of the learners are actually participating in online learning. At the same time, we found that students with disabilities prefer radios to smartphones. And part of it is mainly because there's no accessible content. We also found that students in rural areas versus those who are in urban areas, there's more learning compared to students in the rural areas. We also found that actually students with hearing impairments are the least engaged in e-learning, which was a key finding. We also found that part of this, there's very little support from teachers at this point. So, the other finding that was important to us is that there's adverse psychosocial and financial stress on families, parents, and students. And also students are very distressed and socially isolated, especially students with disabilities, and they're very concerned about their education. We also found out that there's more preference for students to be in school. Most students do not want to be at home. And what's happening is part of it is at home, they're focusing more on chores. At the same time, some students are bored and there's too much social distancing, which is affecting their learning. And parents of students with disabilities are definitely concerned about the health and nutrition of their students. And the fact that teachers also are not offering any meaningful support to students at home. So in conclusion, one, we found that some learning is definitely going on at home, but with lots of challenges. electronic learning is mainly accessed via television, and definitely there's a need for learners with disabilities. They're most disadvantaged, so there's a need to look into this space, but most importantly, there's a need to develop content, accessible content, and the fact that parents are really stressed about the impact of COVID-19 on learning and on the students. So our key recommendations is, one, we need to develop accessible learning materials. We need to ensure there are devices for both students and teachers, and their families need to understand how to use those devices. And we also, there's also learners with disabilities require more attention to their health and nutritional needs, and also a need for stakeholders to come together to facilitate inclusive remote learning for all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, very much for sharing these important findings from the case study that you recently conducted. I think very rich findings in there, and highlighting the needs that are specifically there for children affected by school closures overall, and particularly highlighting the needs for children with disabilities. And I think you put it very well, that the digital divide there that we see all over countries is particularly affecting children with disabilities, and we need to be aware of their needs. And thank you for raising that call to action for the need for more accessible digital learning materials and a greater awareness of this. So I'd like also, with these findings and highlights that you just brought from the study, turn it over to our second panelist, Mr. Fred Haga from the Directorate of Special Needs Education in the Ministry of Education in Kenya. Could you tell us a bit and shine a bit of light on what the Kenyan government has done in these recent months to provide solutions to some of these challenges that Irene just mentioned in the area of children and students living with disabilities in the Kenyan education system? Over to you, Fred.
Thank you, Florian. When the first case of COVID-19 was reported in Kenya back in March, the most immediate action that was taken by the government through the Ministry of Education was to close all institutions of learning at all levels and send the children, the learners, home. This meant that more than 13 million learners in various stages at various levels had to go home. Once that was done, the ministry started exploring how these children would be engaged productively so that some form of learning could still continue even though they are home. So through the ministry's agency, the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development, the government mounted remote learning programs, and there are 3 of them in particular. Radio programs, TV programs through the Edu channel, and learning mounted on the Kenya Education Cloud. So unfortunately, we in government, we were alive to the fact that not all learners were accessing these 3 approaches, or these 3 modes of learning, remote learning, that were mounted. And so the cabinet secretary made it clear that when schools will open, no child, no learner is going to be disadvantaged in any way, that schools may start from where they stopped. Turning the focus onto learners with disabilities, they were unduly disadvantaged in many ways because of accessibility. Some of them come from areas where there is no connectivity, electricity, or even TV signals, and many of them do not have devices to receive these programs on. So in a study that was conducted by KISE and the ministry, it was determined that not very many of these learners with special needs are actually learning. But there was also the whole discussion around accessibility of the lessons, because, for instance, those learners with hearing impairment would watch the television programs, but there would be no captioning initially or sign language interpretation. And so it meant very little. And even though, for instance, learners with visual impairment can listen to the radio, learning is much, much more than just sitting and listening to radio. Learning is an engagement. They needed to take notes, for instance, to write, and that wasn't really possible because many of these learners had left their devices at school, because the model that we use is that most of the devices or the assistive devices like the braillers, for instance, is property of the school. And so when the children are going home, these devices remain in school. However, the ministry and its partners managed to develop specialized programs, at least that would be accessible to these learners, and material or content that was accessible, that if uploaded, content that could actually be accessed, but only if these learners had their devices to receive and use these programs. However, that was done so that those learners with disabilities who at least were within the right ranges of connectivity and had devices, and I must say there are not very many of them, at least would follow and continue with the lessons. But then the ministry also realized that many of these learners had other issues, other challenges beyond just not being able to access lessons or programs. And it became a case of livelihoods, because there are some of those children who are able only to access food and other support services when they are in school. And so the ministry, in collaboration with other partners, began interventions that were meant to provide livelihoods to the different families, the different children, while at home. The argument was that at least if food and other basics are provided to these children, then the parents may have a little time to concentrate or focus on them and help them with their land, because they'll not need to go out to look for food. And we have examples where that seemed to really work well. Different organizations that would put together kits and send them to the families that were identified and could be reached. And then the focus, as this was happening, the ministry developed a COVID-19 response plan. What to do in response to the pandemic, how to do it, and eventually how to prepare for reopening of institutions. And as I speak today, we already know that the ministry has made a decision that there's going to be phased reopening of institutions, starting with the teachers' colleges and universities, especially the examination classes. Next week, we are having the grade 4, class 8, and Form 4 going back to school. So in terms of the preparation for going back to school, the ministry has been conducting an assessment of the different schools to make sure that they are well prepared and they are not going to be points of risk to spread the virus when the learners finally come back to school. And amidst this conversation, children with disabilities and other special needs have not been left behind, in the sense that some of their schools were also visited, and the chair of the Special Head Teachers Association of Kenya, Special Schools Head Teachers Association, was appointed by the ministry to be part of the of the committee that was working on the guidelines and modalities of responding to the pandemic. And that team completed its work and gave its report to the cabinet secretary, in which it outlined measures that needed to be taken, the kind of investment that were required, and also flagging out the challenges that had been observed. And this report is what informed the quality assurance officers who again went to visit, sampled some schools and visited, and gave specific recommendations around mainly those three areas of social distancing, issue of hygiene and sanitation, washing of hands and all that, but also how to wear face masks, how to protect yourself. And all this information has now been packaged in modules that are being sent to the schools, and the schools are expected to train teachers, non-teaching staff, and even the learners to sensitize them so that they are fully aware of what to do and what not to do even as they prepare to come back to school. We are also still learning a few things as we proceed, and children with disabilities are also, we do know their unique needs, and the ministry is trying to make sure, working with partners actually like UNICEF, to make sure that they are not at risk anymore than the other children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Haga, to summarize the efforts of the Kenyan government to provide learning and to provide learning while schools were closed for an extended period of time, highlighting the three modes of content delivery for continuity of learning and remote learning using TV, radio, and the internet, and highlighting also some challenges that children with disabilities face to actually access these remote learning opportunities, maybe with the lack of accessibility overlays or the lack of devices that you highlighted, and laying out the plan for the phased reopening of schools. Something I think if we relay it to the study that Irene and Enable shared before, we hear that when schools are closed, schools are providing a lot of different resources for education, not only classroom instruction that are important. So I think that safe or the trying to reopen schools safely will be something very important to ensure that children with disabilities and also without disabilities can access quality learning again. We would like to turn it now over to Leopoldine, our colleague from Namibia. What efforts have been made in Namibia to provide solutions for children with disabilities during this COVID-19 pandemic? And if you could please keep your answer to 4 minutes so that every panelist has some time to share their insights, that would be great. So over to you, Leopoldine, on the response of Namibia, please.
In Namibia, all schools have resumed. That is from pre-primary, in fact, from kindergarten up to grade 12. All the schools have resumed classes. And the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture have ensured that all the protocol measures in terms of COVID-19 management and prevention are ensured. That is inclusive of all schools that are catering for learners with disability. And then if I can draw back during the lockdown, the ministry have ensured that materials are developed that is duty-free, that is safe for the blind learners, but all the materials distributed at the school level and at the national level were translated into Braille. And then also the COVID-19 protocols, measures, information on the management and prevention of COVID-19. So we're also translated in the format that is well understandable, that is fitting all different types of disability, for example, in the Namibian Sign Language and Braille format, and also simplified information that even children with intellectual impairment are able to understand. Provision of different equipment that is necessary for the prevention and management of COVID-19 were also made available, like sanitizers, masks, as well as the mask enable the deaf and children with disability that read facial expressions, which are in the form of face shield, but not really face shield, but it's a type of a mask, which is clear on the lips, and it's enabled to see a deaf child or children with disability when they are communicating in terms of body language, facial expression. Well, we all understand that learners with disability require extra efforts in terms of taking care, nutritional meals and medication. And because of some parents that have lost some income, schools have taken up the initiative and the ministry to ensure that these parents and learners are supported when it comes to food combos. That is very nutritious to cater for the needs for these learners. And some schools have even gone an extra mile to ensure that they procure medication for these learners. When it comes to some challenges that the ministry faced, we have encountered that communication barrier was quite a challenge, especially during the lockdown, as some of the learners could not be traced. That includes learners with disability, although very few of them. As parents, the ministry have ensured that different groups are established to ensure that all the learners are reached through themselves or through the parents. Different groups were created like WhatsApp, and the packages were also produced in various forms to reach all the different types of learners. For example, the blind ones, materials were brailled, and then the audios were also recorded on different lessons that the learners are able to listen to, as well as lessons that are prepared through the Namibian Sign Language, and simplified materials that will suit also learners with intellectual impairments. So we use different Microsoft packages and different social medias to ensure that all the learners were reached, mostly all learners were reached during the lockdown. As a ministry, we have realized that ICT education, digital education was not really taken seriously. And this is when the ministry then realized that we need to budget, not only for now, but for the future as well, to ensure that we go digital way, because COVID-19 has teach us a lot of things that we need to think out of the box. So this comes with the deployment of different ICT materials that were deployed to schools. And I must inform you that all the special schools in Namibia have received some tablets that they can use for this purpose. And then teachers at the national level, training was initiated from the national level to ensure that teachers are capacitated on how to use the different ICT materials, how to develop online content, and so on. But I must tell you that it's something that was not easy, and it's not easy and going on. I must also thank our development partners and different donor agencies out there, especially UNICEF, that is in terms of a child. They has been very, very close to the ministry during this trying time. UNICEF Namibia, we owe it to you because a lot of efforts that the ministry have embarked on, we couldn't have managed without UNICEF Namibia, plus many other donor agencies. And I think this virus has also taught us to, to get closer. When you have a challenge, everybody's was looking up upon to the Ministry of Education, and we appreciate all the efforts from the different angles. And I must tell you that children with disability, some of them were victims of social evils when they were still at home during the lockdown. We understand, I'm not sure if this is also happening in other countries, that children were raped, stigmatized, and emotionally abused during this time when they were at home. So this drew us back to say that school is the safest place where these children can be kept and be handled, especially children with disability. Where the Ministry of Education is not doing so much well is when it comes to psychosocial support. That is something that is we have in the ministry, but I must say that we concentrate much more on giving psychosocial support to the learners, but we leave out the teachers. The teachers are also drained in this process in terms of financial constraints, and as well as just, the pandemic is new, everybody's overwhelmed, and the closing and opening of schools. So everybody is affected, not only the learners, but the teachers as well. But the ministry tend to pay much more attention to the learners, of which the teachers, in my view, also need to be given the psychosocial support in order to support the learners at the best of their ability. So basically, the picture in Kenya is the same in Namibia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for highlighting this response in Namibia and the challenges. Encouraging to see the use of digital learning, and also thank you for highlighting the sobering realities of child protection, and that we know that children with disabilities are more affected by violence against children, and thank you for highlighting this important element as well. I want to now turn it over to our panelist, Ambrose, from Light for the World. Could you please tell us from your perspective, what do you think, what do schools need from government or technologies, from technology companies to get it right, to get digital accessible materials for children and for learning into the schools, and what roles can NGOs play, and NGOs like yours? Ambrose, if you can keep it to 4 minutes, we're coming to the end of our panel, that would be great. Thank you, over to you.
Thank you very much, Florian. Good morning to you all, or good afternoon to our colleagues from other countries. I'm so happy this morning, first, and also speaking, having listened to our colleagues, other panelists. Honestly, what you have elaborated is a reality and it's across different nations. However, before I can respond to your question, I feel it's very important to do something holistically to solve these challenges our learners with disabilities are facing. First, I heard from Kenya, Namibia, those presentations, I feel it's rotating around 4 key challenges our learners are facing. First and foremost, attitude. How at the community, even the parents themselves, the teachers, the peers look at learners with disabilities. Do they value them or not? Then secondly, it's about communication. People are talking about disseminating messages on the radio and the TV. Fred, you explained this very well. The issue of communication, I realize, has been a very, very big challenge. Even Irene, the issue of accessibility is featuring. And also, all that is rotating about participation. Fred said, the issue is not about listening to get the voice from the TV sets, but it involves engagement for a learner to attain quality education. That's about participation. Why? This can be abbreviated in what we call ACAP, ACAP, attitude, communication, accessibility, and participation. But if you want to solve this challenge, it's very important to attend or to solve those 4 key challenges. It's not only about getting a child into the school, but how to ensure that this child can fully participate in the learning. Yeah, from my personal experience and out of the engagement I've had in this inclusive school, what I've realized is that number 1, we need to work with the school management, especially the school management committees, the teachers, to train them to understand the concept of inclusion. Majority of them, they don't understand when we talk of inclusion. How are we able to make the environment, especially learning environment, inclusive? We also need to understand and also provide some tools that these can do the self-assessment in the school to understand where they are doing right or doing wrong and where they need to improve themselves. These tools can help the management to assess themselves. Look at this, the toilets, playgrounds. How are the co-curricular activities arranged to accommodate learners with disabilities? Therefore, the self-assessment tool can play a very key role, because from there, they can be able to come up with action plans that for us, we are not able to interfere. They can do it themselves and hence make solutions. But at the same time, we need to work so closely with the parents of these learners with disabilities. Because parents, some of them can act as role models. You know, when we have a parent that is doing well, supporting a child with disability, this can also attract or convince more parents. Now, there are also structures for people with disabilities in every country. How are these organizations? Okay. Then we need to come up with these structures and also bring on board the role models. Their learners with disability have excelled. This can also help us to come up with an idea on how to approach or support each and every learner with disabilities depending on the category of disability. Over 70% of children with disabilities, most of them are denied education. They are hidden at home. Therefore, if we are able to look at those structures and also use role models, this can help our learners to attain education. So let me go back to the question. You know, when we talk of the government, technological companies, and NGO, what they should do, first and foremost, the government should provide supportive policies. You know, in African countries, most of them don't have clear policies on inclusive education. They always say there's always financial implication, it's very expensive, therefore you cannot be able to afford that. And sometimes they always look at special needs education alone. We need to shift away from that. However, research has revealed that special education is more expensive than inclusive education. Another way, the government, sometimes government come up with policies, but when it comes to implementation, these policies remain in shelves. They want also to export to international donors or funders that we have policies on the ground. But when it comes to implementation, there's nothing being done. Now, when I go to technological companies, they need to think along some practical solutions. Many technological companies never have that consultation with the children themselves, with disability themselves. Why don't they come up with a lab to have a co-creation, like in terms of workshop, where they could engage with children themselves so that they can get ideas on how they can be able to solve problems locally in the situation where they live. We should always stop that idea of technological transfer, say from other countries like Europe, developed from another setting, and then brought to Africa. Sometimes context or situation differ. Therefore, technological companies need to engage learners with disability on the ground and design technology can suit on the ground. Like in many African countries, I can tell you members. Yes, most of them, when it comes to electricity, it's a challenge. Infrastructure, technology is low, yet these technology need connections. Just as somebody said, in the rural setting, how can you use this technology where there's no electricity, where there's no power? Also, technological companies should help to develop some apps, applications like referral services apps. Many parents, probably if they have children with disabilities, some of them, they don't know how to support their children, how to provide or get assistive devices, how to communicate with their children. They lack that knowledge. They always ask themselves, if there are apps that are developed and somebody is able to access the app with this content, this can help to educate a parent on how to handle a child with disability. So under technological companies, the idea is not about you making technology and bring to Africa or to the community, but also the transfer of skills. For example, the teachers. Are the teachers already taught on how to make these local material or local technologies? Because there are some technologies, for example, those with hearing impairment, they use visual aid, visual materials. We have a number of trees, materials. Somebody can cut a tree and be able to make a training material that can be able to impact the skills.
Ambrose,
Lastly,
sorry, can we get, lastly, to the last point, please.
Yes, now to the NGOs. NGOs, wherever you work, just as what I talk to the government, if it's very silent, try to come in and support and also help develop some tools. For example, making self-assessment tools, the teachers, and also help to guide those who plan to school to be very inclusive. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambrose, for this very valuable insight and the framework you presented. I think, it is very valuable to have these different stakeholders come together. Yeah, we're already at the end of our session. Perhaps just to summarize some of the elements and also mention briefly the role that UNICEF, the organization that I'm working for, the United Nations Children's Fund, is doing in Kenya, but also in other countries, and I'm happy Leopoldine mentioned it as well. I think the real importance here is that you need different stakeholders to come together to ensure that children with disabilities and children without disabilities have access to quality education in schools, but also using remote learning as it was done now during COVID. And as schools reopen, I think this is a great opportunity to use the digital learning, the remote learning, with all the challenges that were there during the lockdown and during the remote learning, and bring that into school and use digital learning tools as kind of a blended learning approach while keeping children with disabilities really at the center of the discussion, and see how can these materials be made accessible. And I think it needs a mix of different approaches. Yes, it needs the element of the communities and of the awareness that these are important stakeholders. And I think what Ambrose mentioned, the issue of co-creation is very critical. And I think it's also great that it was highlighted that special education and segregation is actually, while it is practiced still a lot, it is actually a more costly undertaking than inclusive education. So for UNICEF, working together with governments and stakeholders, I think our strong approach is to advocate for inclusive education and also use digital tools to further inclusive education. To that effect, we have worked on a project called the Accessible Digital Textbook. You can find information online on accessibledigitaltextbooksforall.org, a long URL, but you can find some information there. And the idea is to use universal design for learning principles in digital accessibility materials to bring together children with disabilities with whichever impairment they have, or covering the main impairments through this digital innovation. Also to bring them together with children without disabilities. So really to use digital innovations and digital learning materials to further inclusive education, because we know that we need to bring along all children into the education system to make progress, and this will be beneficial for children with disabilities and without disabilities, ultimately raising learning outcomes for every learner in the affected education system. So that is just highlighting very briefly what UNICEF is trying to do in this area, piloting this work on the accessible digital textbook in some of the areas. But I really want to thank, we're really out of time and overstretched the time, and the next session is starting in 2 minutes. So I really want to thank all the panelists for sharing their wide range of experiences, the wide range of viewpoints. And I think we agreed on a lot of points that need to be captured to ensure that more children with disabilities have access to digital learning materials, that there is accessibility to that, and that there is inclusive learning happening, particularly on the continent where there are some systems that are still lacking behind. So I would really want to thank all the participants for their contribution, and wishing our attendees of the conference a fruitful conference and engaging conference in all the sessions that are following today, and really a big thanks to enable as well for putting this together and for keeping advocating on that, working together with governments and stakeholders and NGOs, and especially for children with disabilities, to ensure that they have their right to education realized. So with this, I see it is 1 minute to 10. I hand it over and conclude the session. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Goodbye and have a good morning.